Everybody, thank you. Welcome to the Independent. My name is Fernando Garcia. I am here with Amy Tobia, chapter leader with Represent Us, which is an anti-corruption organization here in San Diego. Well, it's nationwide, but she's the chapter leader here in San Diego. And I'm going to ask Amy to tell a little bit about herself and what Represent Us is all about here in San Diego.
Yes, thanks for having me on. The first podcast is exciting to be here.
Yes.
I have been involved in Represent Us for about 6 years now. It is a 10-year-old national organization that really focuses on fixing the core of our political process. They focus on anti-corruption initiatives, ranked choice voting, anti-gerrymandering initiatives, really making voting more possible and more powerful. In states where they have had a lot of attacks against just basic voting rights. They do work there, and they've had 161 successful initiatives and campaigns in 10 years. They're a nonpartisan organization, and the way that they work is they have chapters all over the country that look around at their community, the way we're looking at San Diego, and try to decide how we can deliver a more representative democracy in our own community. So I have been volunteering with them for that amount of time and enjoying it quite a bit.
That's awesome. Now, are there other organizations that you work with that Represent Us works with? And can you explain maybe some of those that have collaborated with Represent Us?
Sure. There are a lot of different groups who either make democracy reform a main platform of their organization, like Common Cause, or groups like League of Women Voters, where democracy reform is part of what they look at. So over the years, we have partnered with a number of organizations, League of Women Voters, Fair Vote on ranked choice voting efforts in each different city and state. There have been other partnerships as well. Locally, we've partnered with groups like Independent Voter Project, Open San Diego. And so we reach out for any organization that values democracy reform and wants to partner in that nonpartisan space. We will work with.
Awesome. And, being involved in politics, I've noticed that it's not for everybody. A lot of people obviously love to talk about politics and some of the changes, but very few people actually decide to make that effort to do something week in and week out. And you're somebody who I know personally who's very committed to the changes. What got you to the point to where you said, hey, I need to do something about this? Like, I need to take the initiative. What was there something that went on in your life? Was there somebody maybe in your childhood that gave you that inspiration? What was it for you?
Yeah, I think I can't remember a precise moment.
Yeah.
I just knew that after I had attended the first couple of meetings with Represent Us, and I had gone looking for a way to be more involved in my community.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I felt like I had the ability to set aside some time, even though I had 2 little kids.
Yeah.
And that I wanted to do more than I was doing. I looked at getting involved in some other activities, and it just didn't seem as meaningful to me as making our democracy work better.
Yeah.
I was really drawn to the idea of creating a more fair system. And I think that's why I have ended up being so committed, because there's an essential lack of fairness in our current system.
Sure, absolutely.
And my history and my upbringing, I have 3 younger brothers.
Okay.
So my job was always to make sure that they all had the exact same amount of everything, right? So I was the fairness monitor.
Yeah.
And I think I've taken that into my adulthood,
Yeah.
and I see people who would be qualified for running for office and they don't have the financial means, or they don't have access, and that's not fair, or
Right.
people who are otherwise held back from full participation in our democracy, and that's not fair.
Yeah.
And so I really think I'm kind of called to it, because it seems wrong to be aware of that lack of fairness in our system and not try and do something about it.
Nice. Awesome. Now, were you somebody who maybe growing up, like in high school, were you like an ASB? Did you run for class president or anything like that?
Yeah. I did not get involved in student government at all.
Okay.
I was in debate.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I think the closest that you could get that to would be the fact that I did participate in debate. I was too busy. I was in, singing and track and cross country, and, did debate and did, a bunch of other things. And so didn't have time for student government, but I did take debate. Maybe that's what hooked me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I've noticed, one of the big things that Represent Us is trying to, that really promotes, is ranked choice voting.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's starting to, more and more people are starting to hear that term.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain to me what ranked choice voting is?
Sure. So ranked choice voting is a way of voting where instead of picking a single candidate, you rank each of the candidates.
Okay.
So similar to when you're filling out a poll for something that you bought on Amazon, for example.
Mhm.
So instead of, if you were on a ballot,
Yeah.
I can only pick you or one other person. I can rank you,
Okay.
and maybe you're my favorite, and then there's a second, third, and fourth. And it sounds like such a simple little thing, right?
Right.
Instead of picking one, I'm just going to rank them.
Right.
But it can be genuinely transformative in candidate behavior, first of all, and
Yeah.
how the candidates are accountable. And from a voter standpoint, I get to give you my perspective and opinion on every single one of those candidates. So
Mhm.
I have now a lot more voice in the election for the
Sure.
same, same ballot that I'm turning in.
So to kind of, what an example would be, like, let's just say in the last election where you had Biden, you had Trump, you had like an Andrew Yang, let's just say to kind of put it into simple terms, there's a primary.
Mhm.
So in the ranked choice voting, how do you decide who moves on? Is it the top five? How does that work?
Sure. Well, every place that's using ranked choice voting does it a little bit differently.
Okay.
Because again, we're not about using democracy reform to shoehorn the exact same reform into every community. That
Right.
would be disingenuous, and every community doesn't need the exact same reform.
Right.
So really, some places adopt ranked choice voting in only the primary.
Okay.
So for example, New York City, they used
Yeah.
it in their primary last year. We could use ranked choice voting in the primary to decide which candidates go forward from each party with a positive process of ranking, as opposed to the winner skates by the thinnest margin.
Sure,
Correct?
sure.
Or we could eliminate the primary and use ranked choice voting in the general election, which is what they did in Alaska.
Okay. Awesome.
So you can do it a couple of different ways, and it's just up to each community and location to figure out how to do it.
Nice. Yeah. And some of the issues too are with the campaign finance reform. Can you go into a little bit about what Represent Us is attempting to do with campaign finance reform, and what are some of the ideas that are out there, like democracy dollars?
Yeah. So campaign finance reform is interesting because one of the things about working in the nonpartisan space is the fact that there are so many issues that voters from whatever of the multiple parties that are out there come from agree on.
Right.
And one of them is campaign finance reform, that we are spending too much money on elections, and the money is diluting voters' power and voters' authority. So campaign finance reform can happen in a couple of different ways. In some cities and states, they are limiting the amount of money that people can fundraise in elections in order to control that. There's some pros and cons there. The other thing that you can do is you can empower voters with democracy dollars, which is happening in Seattle and Oakland, or a matching fund program, in order to make sure that people can run from average, everyday, ordinary means, right?
Okay,
so
right.
One of the challenges of this huge escalation in what we're spending our elections is it puts running for office out of reach of a lot of Americans.
Right.
And so you lose out on a good candidate pool because of that. So with democracy dollars, candidates would be able to go to their neighbors, and every registered voter would have democracy dollars to give to them to fund their campaign. And so it really diversifies the donor pool, and it makes it possible for more voters to have a say in who lands on their ballot and more good candidates to run. So there's a lot of ways to do reform. One of them is to create a different avenue towards that money.
And for an example would be, let's just say I'm running as a candidate and I knock on your door, and let's just say San Diego had democracy dollars. And I'll give an example. Let's say you have $40, maybe 4 $10 vouchers that you can give to candidates. So if I came knocking on your door and maybe you liked my spiel, you liked what I was about, in essence, you could give me 10 of that dollars.
Sure.
And divvy up the other 30 amongst other candidates or whoever for other offices. Or you could just not give that money to anybody. It just stays, and it's taxpayer money, so it just stays in the general fund, basically.
Correct.
Is that okay?
Yeah. You could choose to participate or not.
Okay.
So it's one of those shocking things that less than 1%, in fact, nationally, less than 0.5% of registered voters donate to campaigns. The donors are the deciders.
Right.
So the people who donate to campaigns are the ones who decide who are going to be on your ballot. If a candidate doesn't have enough cash to get on the ballot, they can't.
Yeah.
So the donors have a lot more power than just the voters. And so if we make every voter have the option of becoming a donor, then we're creating a little bit more power there, so that they're more likely to see someone on the ballot that reflects their community.
And it makes somebody who's more involved in the community, who maybe doesn't have a lot of money
Mhm.
and doesn't want to go after big donors because they don't want to be beholden to the big
Correct.
donors, to just really focus on the community and ask the community for
Mhm.
their financial support without them actually technically having to dig out of their own pocket,
Correct.
but out of the taxpayer funds.
Yeah.
And
I mean, we can't just magically poof and make a not good candidate
Right.
viable by having them participate in this program.
right,
They have to be a good candidate, but we're creating a path. We're creating a path for a good candidate to be able to navigate it without those large donors and without being cut out of the process.
awesome. And what are some of the, like, in your opinion, I'm going to go back to ranked choice voting. What would you say? Why is it important for us to have ranked choice voting? Like, why don't we just do the current system that we have right
Sure.
now?
So I first would say, are you happy with the current system and the outcomes, right? So in the current system where you have two parties
Yep.
who dominate most of our elections, as much as we know that there are other parties out there, we have two parties who dominate.
Yeah.
What we've come to is sort of a state of impasse. We've watched from a congressional level as the amount of progress and bipartisan bills getting passed year after year dwindles and dwindles and dwindles. And we have these constant stalemates and shutdowns
Right.
because of that process. And what ranked choice voting has the power to do is to create an opportunity for candidates to listen to more voters, right? Because if you're running for office
Right.
and you knock on my door and I say, no, I've already voted for the other gal, like
Yeah.
she's got my vote.
Yeah.
You will walk away under the current system. You will be not interested in talking to me, hearing from me, understanding me because I've made my choice. But if in the ranked choice voting system, candidates have a reason to continue that conversation.
Right.
Like sitting and talking with me is
Yeah.
how you might win a second choice vote or a third choice vote.
Yeah.
So it changes the nature of our political process to make it less toxic and more, conversation centered.
Right.
And it allows candidates to have those conversations and be beholden to more voters. And then from a voter standpoint, I mean, I don't know about you, but I have frequently been looking at a ballot and felt very conflicted about my
Right.
vote.
Yeah.
And if you want to vote your values, being able to rank
Yeah.
gives you the option of voting your values without putting your values also at risk.
Yeah. Because the common theme right now, I think, in politics is that people are constantly feeling like they're having to vote the lesser of two evils.
Correct.
And, it just feels like ranked choice voting is the answer to that.
Yeah.
You
You want to be able to vote authentically,
That's right.
but you
Right.
also don't want to put things at risk if that choice, the
Yeah.
policy impacts of what our elected officials do is important.
Yeah.
Everybody who says, I don't want to get involved in politics is messy. Well, politics is how we define our future
Yeah.
and define the world around us and how everything gets done. So when you disengage from that, you're kind of ceding,
Yeah.
all of your participation, I guess.
Yeah. One of the things I've always felt too is that living in a democracy means that citizenship is harder, meaning that you have to be more involved
Yeah.
in a democracy. If you want, the government to just tell you what to do and you don't have to worry about politics, then you're probably better off in a socialist or communist kind of system where they're just going to tell you what to do. You do what they say, end of story. But in a democracy, you really have to be involved.
Yeah.
You have to be engaged because at the end of the day, it seems like a democracy can be hijacked by other than the people, other than the citizens.
Mhm.
So, and I think that's why these issues are important, why people need to get involved, obviously. That's why
Well,
you're involved.
and speaking of the hijacking and ranked choice voting, I mean, the idea of reducing the toxicity
Mhm.
so that civic engagement piece can be more palatable and
Yeah.
more enjoying and more appealing to people. When you feel like you don't have a stake in the game, you're not
Yeah.
going to show up and play.
Yeah,
So
yeah, absolutely. Now, I know that ranked choice voting and different campaign finance reform ideas have been attempted here in San Diego. Is that correct?
Well, campaigns have been started to try and get them
Okay.
made into law. Obviously, other parts of our state and other parts of our country have had more success
Mhm.
because there are many places in the country that have ranked choice voting and various formats, right? Many places in the country that have matching funds, several places that have democracy dollars. There are places that have transparency dashboards and all sorts of other things that we don't have yet.
Okay.
So we have been trying to, through our work locally, build enough awareness in the community because these things, when we explain them to people, everybody's like, this is great. Why don't we do this already?
Right.
Right. But as you know, changing policy in a climate, any climate, is
Yeah.
going to be challenging.
Very difficult. Yeah.
Yeah.
What are the ways? So, for example, here in, for example, in the city of San Diego, how there are different routes to get something like ranked choice voting on the ballot. But what are those different routes
Sure.
that you can go?
So we are fortunate that we live in a city that's a charter city.
Okay.
So right now in the state of California, if you wanted to adopt some reforms like ranked choice voting, if you did not live in a charter city, you actually aren't allowed to,
Oh, wow.
because there has been many attempts to try and get the governor to overturn that, but so far no passes.
Okay.
So you have to live in a charter city to adopt ranked choice voting. We do. So we could adopt ranked choice voting one of two ways. City council could decide that this is good policy based on studying it and coming up with some version of it, and they could put it on the ballot for voters to vote on.
Okay.
Or we could do a signature gathering effort, and we could gather enough signatures to either do one of two things: put it on city council's docket, so basically skipping the rules committee review and putting it on their full docket, in which they would weigh in on it and then vote up or down as to whether to move it forward.
Okay.
So that's the second way. And the third way is to do signature gathering and to put it on the ballot for voters to vote on.
And I'm assuming the easiest way would be and the least expensive and time consuming would be for city council themselves, correct?
Yeah.
And has that been a challenge? It's fun. I always think of a lot of people when they hear ranked choice voting or something like that, they see it as a progressive idea.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of how people look at it. And obviously we're a predominantly Democrat city here in San Diego in terms of the city council.
And voter registration.
And voter registration.
Sure. Majority registered Democrats.
Yeah. So, but it doesn't seem that it's getting a lot of traction, meaning that something that seems so progressive isn't really being endorsed or accepted by a lot of what some people might consider progressive people.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's an interesting perspective to think that ranked choice voting is 100% progressive, because I've actually seen that a lot lately, which is fascinating to me, because the primary opposition against ranked choice voting in a lot of cities and states actually does come from the Democratic Party. In other states, it comes from the Republican Party. So there doesn't seem to be, the parties seem to be unified on their hesitancy in some places. However, the state of Utah is using it on dozens of cities, and that is a Republican city. Yeah. The Republican Party is looking at using it for more party elections, and the Democratic Party uses it for party elections. Yeah. So there's not a lot of consistency as to the parties themselves, either liking or disliking, because it's basically city by city and state by state as to what the response is. What is consistent is that because you're giving voters more power, it is usually considered something that current electeds don't care for. Okay. Because you're changing the system that they've already become successful in, right? So you're already elected office. Yeah. Now you're going to change this. Well, what if I'm no longer successful in this new system? What if giving voters more power, makes it harder? So it is kind of challenging to ask, city council members and whatnot to say, listen, you've been good at doing it this other way, but we think this other way is terrible for voters. We want you to change it, which may put you at, more risk, but it's better for voters. And that's a hard thing to ask them to do. Yeah.
And I find that sometimes people are they're more concerned about power than they are about democracy. Yeah. And that's, never a good thing. Yeah. And you did name a few cities like Oakland, Utah. I think also Alaska uses ranked choice voting. Yep. What are some of the Minnesota?
A bunch of cities in Minnesota. The whole state of Maine. Okay. Nevada just passed it.
Nice. Yeah. What are some of the what are some of the outcomes of that in terms of who are the people that are running more? How are the voters more engaged? Is it seeing the outcome? Are the results? Is the outcome better? Are you seeing improvement?
Yeah. I think that is one of the interesting things about watching ranked choice voting get adapted into so many different areas is when you read the follow-up research and the follow-up studies, they all are studying different things. Okay. So they're adopting the same policy, with the intent on reaping different rewards out of it. Not that they will, not all get the same rewards,
Right.
but they're looking for something specific.
Yeah.
So they did a really interesting study in Minnesota, which was an interesting adoption because they adopted it in the Twin Cities.
Mhm.
So they had one city adopt it 4 years in advance of the other city.
Mhm.
So they were actually much better able to study its impact on
Yeah.
polarization and positive campaigning than some
Yeah.
other communities,
Okay.
because they had two side-by-side
Yeah.
similar communities doing this adaptation, and they were able to see how it moved the needle on that. They actually measured word choices used by candidates during debates and campaigning, and were actually able to show
Yeah.
that there was more positive campaigning, less trash talking. Maine was able to show less negative mailers. And so certain outcomes like that,
Yeah.
they've been able to actually kind of start to track. In other communities, in California, they haven't been looking at that so much. They've
Okay.
been more looking at how are they increasing opportunities for women, for BIPOC candidates,
Yeah.
and same in New York. And they've been measuring that and seeing great success in an increase in the number of women,
Nice.
BIPOC candidates who make it to office.
Okay.
So if you compare non-ranked choice cities of the same size to ranked choice cities, you will see that the ranked choice cities hit to 50% parity,
Okay.
and non-ranked choice cities are usually at 25%.
Nice. That's awesome. Also, in the realm of campaign finance reform, one of the things, and we've talked about this before, is that when with cities or states that do have some level of public finance,
Mhm.
that the candidates are given the option to choose public finance, that the voters appreciate that,
Mhm.
that they tend to be more successful when candidates choose to go the public finance route as opposed to the private finance route.
Yeah, it's really interesting because San Francisco, New York have had pretty robust public financing systems for a long time, and really great transparency dashboards around it. And it's interesting in New York because the current Attorney General of New York actually was a publicly financed matching funds candidate when she was in a borough position. So the borough elections, they have found that if there's a lot of boroughs, so 54, 55, something like that. They have found over the years that before they implemented this program, people would literally buy an office. I mean, millionaires could run a campaign, and the folks who lived in those communities didn't have the ability, quite honestly, to always compete with that. So they introduced this program and saw a huge transformation. And this is at the city level. So don't get confused with the state. The state doesn't have this program. And so they've had a huge transformation, and they have found that when a candidate decides, hey, I'm going to run for office with my own money, and I'm not going to participate in the program, and somebody runs, as long as that candidate is a viable candidate, the public finance candidates usually win the majority of the time. Not 100%, but pretty significant. Same thing that they found with democracy dollars. So if voters are looking at somebody and they see where their money comes from, like all of your campaign money came from the community, or all of it came from this program, this matching funds, they are much more likely to be confident. And it's about trust, inspiring trust in our elections again.
Absolutely.
So if they know that's where your money came from, instead of you just bought your way into office, it's a very different motivation when they're voting for you.
Awesome. So. And, one of the things I've noticed too is that in, political parties like to cherry pick, sometimes we call them the anointed one. They like to pick the anointed one. That anointed one is usually somebody that maybe came up through the ranks, worked for a campaign, was very loyal. They're the one who get the support and the money from whatever party. And what I've noticed is that it creates more of somebody who's loyal to the party rather than to their constituents. Have you noticed that as well? Do you see that? And then is this part of the reason why you're big on ranked choice voting and campaign finance reform?
I mean, I can't share stories because people have told me over the years who've run for office, and they've told me the stories of how they were asked to stand aside and not run for that office because it was somebody else's turn. And I get that if you have somebody and they've been in your party and they volunteered for a long time, that you would want to elevate them. That makes perfect sense. But when it becomes exclusionary at the expense of good community members or other folks who have worked equally hard in other aspects of community, maybe they worked in the PTA or they did other things in order to support their community. The voters should be the final arbiter of that, right? So it's not that you can't support a candidate who has been loyal and faithful, but the voters really shouldn't pay the price of having fewer choices. And not having the option of, picking a woman who's been on the PTA for 10 years over somebody who's maybe taken a different path if they prefer the other candidate. And I think that's what Democracy Dollars can do. And that's what ranked choice voting can help with, is creating a path for good candidates who wouldn't have a path otherwise. It doesn't solve every problem. It's creating access, right?
Absolutely.
Access to our elections. So we voters get more opportunity to express ourselves, and we get better choices.
Awesome.
So,
it's funny when I think about the anointed, I think about like the congressman, is it George Santos?
Yes.
And I think about just the debacle that he's caused, and the fact that they don't, I just can't imagine being caught in that many lies and not just resigning.
It's demoralizing.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not a member of that party or from where he lives, but it's demoralizing to see how high we hold each other up in terms of our, how we treat each other, and how we allow things like that to permeate our society, to say, yeah, I'm an American and he's one of my Congress members. It's kind of embarrassing, and we have had our own local issues. There's just been some recent issues with Chula Vista and, where people kind of, once you start bending the truth, how far do you bend it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And when we as Americans have just become so accepting of that being normal from our politicians, how do we fix that?
Yeah.
Because you and I wouldn't treat each other
right. I would.
So why is it okay? So
Yeah.
why is that okay on the
crazy.
Political stage for that to be, given a pass?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the guys, somebody that I've always, one of the people that really introduced me to things like ranked choice voting and was Andrew Yang when he came out. And he's a big supporter, and he's looking for different ways to, combat this duopoly.
Sure.
Kinda, what are your thoughts on third party candidates, somebody like an Andrew Yang, and do you think having more people like him are good for the country? Is that something that that he's probably maybe more of a qualified candidate than most?
So it's interesting that our democracy, old, is not the model that most other democracies follow.
Okay.
So, first off,
and what do you mean by that?
So having basically two major parties in a democracy making all the decisions, that's not how other countries have done it.
Right.
Which is why our democracy is not at the top of the rankings. We're like in the 20s and 30s. Like there's other democracies that are considered to be more equitable in how they empower their voters and more representative. And usually they have a different form of representation that gives voters more representation than ours particularly does. And usually they're multi-party democracies for the most part. Multi-party, not two. Two is not the same.
Yeah.
And so the fact that others have not copied us verbatim because they've seen some of our outcomes is, I think, a kind of a clear sign that we should look at what we're doing.
Yeah, make some changes.
And even before Andrew Yang, a lot of his approach is based on the book by Catherine Grail, who wrote the book, the Political Industrial Complex. I just slaughtered that. It's close. But check out her book. And she wrote that book with another professor, and really got into why an approach to changing our representation through ranked choice voting was a good step. Right? Like it's possible and it's powerful. There's a lot of other things that we could do, but it's kind of a good core change at the federal level. There's other things we could do beyond that, but in terms of changing behavior and changing outcomes and creating a representative government that's really more focused on what they accomplish, as opposed to sound bites. And so I think, he's picked up on that and moved that forward. The thing is without policies like ranked choice voting, going to a third party, you have your vote splitting, and you have, again, it's that, how do I as a voter become empowered to have more choice without it hurting me?
Perfect.
And ranked choice voting is kind of the only way to accomplish that.
Awesome. Now, tell, for those people who are watching and love the ideas of ranked choice voting, want to get involved, how can they go about either contacting Represent Us, being part of Represent Us? How would they go about doing that?
Sure. So we have a local website and a national website.
Mhm.
You can go online and fill them out. And if you fill it out at the national website, they'll send us an email and say, "Hey, there's a new person in San Diego." But there's also a local website. So represent us San Diego.org. And you can find us on either one of those. We also have Facebook and Twitter. And if you want to get involved in a local campaign, there's a lot that we're working on.
Okay.
And if you want to get involved statewide, there's also a lot of things that we're working on. And again, we form partnerships with people. So right now we're looking at doing a partnership with a group out of LA that is working on a statewide campaign finance reform effort. And so, there's just a lot of things like it seems like a lot, but I think the urgency is there, right?
Absolutely.
If we look at the past few years and we look at the increase in money and the decrease in satisfaction and how little we're getting done and how urgent our crises are in our country, our infrastructure, education, our climate, we need to make progress on everything. And we really need a political process that's responsive.
Awesome.
And if our politicians were employees and they were performing, they would get performance reviews and they would get booted out. So we need to figure out a system that increases that level of accountability, but also creates more conversation.
Well, Amy, I really appreciate you coming on this podcast here. I also appreciate the work you do at Represent Us. And, for those of you watching, please go to the Represent Us website. They have a lot of great events. You can also email me directly if you'd like. And thank you for attending. Thank you, Amy, so much.
Yeah.
And hope to see you again soon.
Yeah.
All right.
Good luck.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.